funding for Art of the Western World was provided by the Annenberg CPB project.
At first, the doctors thought it was sciatica, and then they admitted it was gangrene. The old man suffered greatly those last days. And then, on the 31st of August, 1715, the clergy gathered around him, and they began, timidly, to chant the Ave Maria. All through the night, they carried on chanting. And then, at 8:15 in the morning, in the royal bed in the great chamber in the center of the palace, Louis XIV, the Sun King, died, like every man. So wrote a contemporary diarist. It's often said that when Louis died, an age died with him. Not that there weren't other Louis to succeed, but the age of absolute monarchs, the age of which Versailles is a symbol, was drawing to an end. Things would never be the same again. For Louis, Versailles was intended, first of all, to be a garden. And he imagined that garden as a sort of outdoor palace built next to the one constructed in stone. And the one could not be understood without the other. And in the garden, Louis exercised the same despotism over nature that he did indoors over his court. These two tyrannies changed, softened even over the long years of the reign. The most famous formal garden in Europe, with its rigorous geometries of terraces and staircases, its regular parterre, gave way gradually to a greater informality of trees and fields, not merely because it was so expensive to keep up, but because a new attitude to nature was developing, more sentimental, intimate, romantic.
The mood of this moment is captured in a painting done not long after Louis's death, Antoine Watteau's Departure from the Isle of Cythera. Here, a group of elegant courtiers prepares to leave the island of love. The painting signals the new attitude, more informal, poetic, and often amorous. In this paradise of Cythera, there are no restraints, and nature itself is free and unconstrained. It was a time in which the argument over nature, exemplified in the idea of the garden, was a serious debate. It was in England that this different attitude to nature arose. The informal, spontaneous, picturesque English garden was seen as an expression of English liberties. The geometric French garden was seen as a reflection of their authoritarian system of government. Thus, in the microcosm of the garden could be read beliefs about the world at large.
Here at Stourhead in Wiltshire, you can see better than anywhere in Europe the way that the early 18th century attempted to create an art of landscape by shaping nature and putting into the landscape buildings created in past styles, medieval, but especially classical. They did so in the belief that a landscape or a garden gives added pleasure if one can savor the effects of past time as one wanders around it. And that sensibility is characteristic of their period.
The poet Alexander Pope said in the 1730s that this architecture or art derived from landscape painting and compared it to a picture, and that's why we call it picturesque. And so, the combination of architecture and picturesque landscape became one of the characteristics of 18th century aristocratic culture. And wealthy patrons sought architects who would design them country estates unparalleled anywhere in Europe.
This is Zion House, the seat of the Dukes of Northumberland. The 11th Duke lives there today. Doesn't look very impressive from the outside, but wait till you get in.
Robin Middleton of Columbia University, New York, has developed a highly original approach to the architecture of the 18th century.
The first design for this floor was a simple checkerboard, without these dynamic directional indicators. But all that was to change as the building took form. The interiors here are amongst the first works of one of the most brilliant architects of the period, Robert Adam. He wanted to design just like a landscape gardener. He writes of the rise and the fall of the hills and dales, but especially of the movement between them. These effects he wanted to get when he put his masses together. These were notions of picturesque composition. He uses them outside and inside. When he uses his moldings and his patterns, he's modeling spaces and he's trying to show you how to move through them. Let me show you what I mean. Come along. Well, you won't be surprised to learn that that door leads off to the Duke's private apartments. The niche here is large, soft, intimate, well, almost. But at the other end of the hall, something very different happens. And there's a dynamic pattern on the ceiling and on the floor, which is going to lead you into that alternative direction. The niche here is hard and strong and elevated. Adams contrived a change of levels here, which takes you up the stairs into the great staterooms beyond. The first room beyond the hall is the vestibule, a dazzling room, a riot of harsh color and gold, altogether proper for the first anteroom of one of the first peers of the realm. 12 columns give order to this room. They were said to have been found in the bed of the Tiber in Rome. They're not just elements of ostentation, though they clearly are that. Adam uses them to make an awkward room with oddly spaced window openings into a neat cube in effect. That line of columns we've just passed marks out a square. But far more interesting, Adams used it to mark out the new axis you take from this vestibule into the sequence of staterooms which goes off from here. First, into the dining room. It was the dining room. There's a screen of columns here which gives you a moment to pause before you're thrust by the moldings into the central space. And then you go on down the same axis into the first drawing room. Beautiful, fine room. And from that, right through to the beginning of the long gallery, which connects the private apartments and the state apartments. This is the great connecting link in the house, turning the whole circle.
While the English aristocracy chose to live in their great landscaped country houses, the French preferred the sophisticated atmosphere of the city. The court had moved away from Versailles to Paris, where the aristocracy built themselves grand town houses, like the Hôtel Soubise of 1739. Behind their plain facades were exquisitely decorated and furnished interiors, where they could entertain themselves, oblivious to the momentous developments in French society beyond their walls. The decoration of these houses is known as rococo, a term which originally referred to the elaborate encrusted ornament popular in French design at this time, which became associated with the art and taste of the pre-revolutionary world itself. One of the most celebrated Rococo artists was François Boucher, court portraitist and painter of allegorical romances. Boucher's works were designed simply to give pleasure, fitting objects of delectation for an aristocracy with so much time and money on their hands. But time was now running out. This is Boucher's Rape of Europa. In the literary and philosophical salons where they met, the middle-class intelligentsia bitterly opposed what they saw as a decadent order. They called for a return to universal values based on nature and reason. They held that art should not be for art's sake alone, but should have a moral and educative content. This viewpoint, which heralded the role art would play in the revolution, was shared by some of the great French thinkers of the time. Voltaire, who spent his life opposing the tyranny of church and state. Rousseau, the social critic who believed nature to be the source of all good. For him, society was the reason why man was born free, but everywhere is in chains. Diderot, who in his encyclopedia attempted to scrutinize all natural phenomena in the light of reason. Diderot's attack on Boucher's provocative odalisque reads like a modern attack on pornography. Today's moral decadence, he said, has led step by step to the corruption of taste, of color, of composition, of character, of expression. This man has no taste. He takes up his brush only to show us bottoms and breasts. For Diderot, it was artists like Greuze who pointed the way forward to a new art, new taste, new morality. His pictures are part of the growth of a new climate in France, part of those almost imperceptible changes in history, of which great events like the French Revolution are the outcome. With Greuze, and here Chardin, we also detect a new theme, that ordinary people have a heroism, that virtue and strength reside in them, not in kings and nobles. And indeed in Chardin's world of middle-class people, are precisely the men and women who would be attempting to take power in the revolution half a century on. But the Age of Reason would find its true means of expression by returning to the source, to classical Greece.
The art of the 18th century is often called neoclassicism, but we shouldn't understand that in the sense of a slavish imitation of classical models. The monuments of classical antiquity had been an inspiration to artists from the Renaissance onwards. Statues like this, the Apollo Belvedere, had been known to Michelangelo and his contemporaries and disseminated in casts and copies throughout Europe, from Versailles to the Soane Museum here in London. This is an 18th century copy. But Greece itself had remained largely unknown. Artists like Poussin were depicting imaginary landscapes. And then, during the 18th century, the discoveries at Herculaneum and Pompeii, Baalbek and Palmyra opened a new horizon on the ancient world. And that was the time that theorists like Winckelmann and slightly later Goethe propounded their theory that the Greek style, this noble simplicity, was the true style, was the perfection of art, that the Greeks had known true and entire liberty because of the light of reason, and that their art had attained its perfection because of liberty. The message for the 18th century then was clear, that this was the art for free peoples, a vision of an ordered and harmonious universe governed by classical ideals of perfection and harmony. Neoclassicism then, perhaps it is, but better to call it the art of the Age of Reason.
In the last half of the 18th century, these ideas grew more and more influential. Even architectural forms would be interpreted in terms of the search for rationality, as seen here in one of the finest examples of the art of the Age of Reason, the Palais Royal.
The Palais Royal is a comparatively quiet and sedate place today. But once upon a time, this was the hub of Paris. This was the center of high and low life. It was a great speculative venture put up to bolster the Orleans family fortunes, and it worked. It was full of shops. If you wanted a book, you came here. If you wanted ribbons, you came here. Prints, anything. So it was full of cafes, too. And everybody in the evening congregated here. Academicians, writers, artists. Everybody came in from town, travelers, soldiers on leave, and of course the girls came too. Not that that ever stopped the ministers coming at all. But that's not the real reason why we're here. We're here to look at this world which in a way represents the obsessions of architects for the previous 100 years. They've been trying to create order. And here you can see order staked out for you. You can see all these columns, an even rhythm. You can calculate exactly where you are. You're in a world you can judge, you can understand. The column, for instance, which had for so long been used as a decorative element, stuck onto walls, was made freestanding. Not only freestanding to reveal its forms, but its structural form. It became a support once again, and which shone off in this way. This honest demonstration seemed to give a new moral dimension to architecture. One of the first buildings in which this new honesty of expression had been consciously attempted was the east front of the Louvre, dating back from the 17th century, 1667 to 1674, but it remained a model of architecture throughout the 18th century. It was designed by Charles Perrault, a scientist. Perrault made the outline of his building almost rectangular. The long facade is almost flat, so is the outline. There's no piling up, no modeling there. Even odder is the fact that the architectural emphasis is on the linking elements, the freestanding runs of columns. The building became known, not surprisingly, as the Louvre Colonnade. Perrault was determined that his columns should not be decorative elements, but, as he thought in ancient Greek architecture, the supports of the building, strong structural supports. He introduced engineering of a very high order into his design. The columns are threaded through with bars of iron, which are linked to crossbars in the stone of the ceiling and anchored into the walls behind. Here is the initial idea that led to the development of reinforced concrete in the 20th century. Almost 100 years later, exactly these same ideas were taken up by another architect, Soufflot, when he was commissioned to build the grandest, the noblest church in all of Europe, the church known as Sainte Geneviève, called the Panthéon today. Actually, you can even see it from here. It's right over there. Tradition and reason were also Soufflot's concerns. He too used freestanding columns to mark out his space and also to do the actual work of supporting the vaults and dome. He wanted to combine the structural elegance of a Greek temple with the lightness of a Gothic church. Here the classical rhythms appear in the nave and aisles with their rows of Corinthian columns. Gothic is hinted at in the flying buttresses hidden above the vaults. He used the same freestanding columns carrying lintels to create a rectangular geometry on the outside too. This is called post and lintel construction. The church was a nightmare to build, but is thought of as a masterpiece of French 18th century architecture. Everyone who could went to Rome in the 18th century. It seemed to be in the center of the ancient world. And it became a new center for art lovers of all kinds. Architects, artists, gentlemen and their hangers-on. Everybody went there. Soufflot went there as a companion of Madame de Pompadour's brother. Soufflot, in fact, went further south. He went down to Naples, to a place called Paestum, where there were 3 surviving Greek temples, and he measured them up. He was virtually the first architect who'd actually seen a Greek temple, let alone recorded it. Giambattista Piranesi was most upset by the idea that Greek was the divine source of architecture. He wasn't, in fact, Roman at all. He was Venetian. He'd come to Rome at the age of 19, but he climbed over the ruins, he excavated, and he recorded the past, in over 1,000 views during St. Life's time, not only the past, but in fact the present of Rome too. Rome was the center of his world. Copper, of course, was very expensive, and he put his wife's dowry into investment into these great plates. So he was very worried indeed, thought that the French might start going off to Athens. So although he had a lot of French friends amongst these critics and architects in Rome, he started attacking them. He ridiculed Greek architecture. But then, just before he died in 1778, he himself went south to Paestum. And in 15 or 16 wonderful drawings, he conjured up the magic of Greek architecture as never before. He showed that the column that the French for so long had thought of as a structural element which they wanted to express honestly was really a piece of sculpture, a piece of beautiful sculpture. After that, with the discovery of Paestum and Greek architecture itself, the aesthetic vision of Europe changed.
So, as often in the history of Western art, changes in ways of seeing coincide with and even anticipate social change. And so it was in the build-up to the French Revolution.
The Saturday night fever of revolution began in earnest when Camille Desmoulins, a left-wing agitator, harangued an inflamed crowd here in the Palais Royal, calling for the overthrow of the monarchy and the establishment of a republic. There was rising unemployment, a growing sense of injustice, and a devastating failure of the harvest had led to a shortage of the main staple of the French diet, bread. People were exasperated. It had been seen in the American Revolution how a tyranny could be overthrown by the force of will of the people alone. And now those democratic ideals ran through the population here like wildfire.
From the moment the Bastille fell in July 1789, artists were at the center of events in a way they'd never been before. And in the career of Jacques-Louis David, art and politics have never been closer. David dominated French painting for 35 years, through the reign of Louis XVI, the Revolution, Napoleon's Empire, and finally the restoration of the Bourbon kings. He had a talent not only for painting, but for survival. As the revolution approached, paintings demonstrating themes of allegiance to state rather than to family began to abound. Although it was painted 5 years before the revolution, David's Oath of the Horatii would become one of the great images of the time. The theme of the Horatii is a sacrificial oath of allegiance to Republican Rome. It is taken by 3 brothers before departing for combat. These are men willing to die out of patriotic duty. Supported by their father, the courage and resolve of the brothers is evident even in their taut and outstretched limbs. Here, men are seen as moral symbols of the highest virtues, while the women are relegated to sit home, weep, and wait. The mothers and sisters, wrapped in soft, pliant draperies, seemed to melt into tender gestures of suffering.
David's great pictures show us how the classical tradition could be used not for the academic or the picturesque, but as a model for political action. These are moral fables, dramas with their austere heroism, their severe sacrificial devotion to the ideal of the state. No wonder that some people who went so far as to blame the cult of classical antiquity for helping bring the revolution about. And nothing better demonstrates the connection between this art and the politics of the time than an extraordinary event which took place only months into the revolution, when Voltaire's old play on the life of Brutus was revived at the National Theatre. At the end, David's picture of Brutus was enacted as a tableau vivant. When Brutus cried, "Gods, give us death rather than slavery," the roars and applause of the audience were so great that it was minutes before order was re-established. Never, said an eyewitness, was the illusion more complete. The spectators became so many Romans. They believed they had participated in the action.
All the great themes of this tumultuous epoch come together in David's painting of the Oath of the Tennis Court. This great declaration of the rights of man in June 1789 was the symbolic beginning of the revolution, Men are born free, the deputies swore, and shall remain free and equal in rights. David himself was deeply committed to the revolution, a member of the National Convention, and he was the obvious choice to paint it. For him, this was contemporary reportage. But the gestures belonged to those nerveless Roman heroes, the Horatii. In the tennis court then, David showed the spectators had indeed become the actors, become new Romans. As a fellow deputy said, to paint this moment we have chosen the painter of the Horatii, this patriot whose genius anticipated the revolution. Unfortunately, their high ideals were not destined to last long.
Vive l'Assemblée nationale!
During those first radical years, David devoted his art to the new republic. One of his friends and heroes was Jean-Paul Marat, the journalist. This friend of the people came to a violent end. He was murdered in his bathtub by his political enemy, Charlotte Corday.
The day after Marat's death, a deputation appeared in the National Convention to offer regrets on behalf of the people. One of the deputies made a speech which is recorded by a contemporary of David, the historian Delescluze. What a crime is this! A parricidal hand has robbed us of the people's most determined defender, a man who died for liberty. We still look among you, expecting to see him here, among you, our representatives. What a spectacle it was, this man in the moment of his death. Where are you, David? You have another picture to paint. And David spoke up, his voice choked with emotion. Yes, I will undertake it.
David painted the picture in 3 months. The death of Marat is a murder story, and we see all the clues to the murder. The blood, the knife, the letter Marat received from Charlotte Corday just before she murdered him. It's a very realistic picture, strongly, movingly realistic. But it is more than that. It has an almost religious intensity, like a secular Pietà, an icon to a martyr for the cause of freedom. In painting this, David created perhaps the greatest single image of the revolution. Now, finally, the age of reason lost its nerve. Soon after Marat's death, David watched from a window in the Place de la Révolution while Marie Antoinette went to the guillotine. He left us a poignant and eloquent sketch. The murder of thousands followed in the purge known as the Terror. The frailty of reason was tragically exposed, and as so often in history, fear of worse disorder led even reasonable men like David to turn to a strong leader to solve their dilemma. The man they thought their savior was Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1815, in the aftermath of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, Tsar Alexander of Russia visited Paris and saw the Vendôme column crowned by its imperial statue of Napoleon. Were I to be so highly elevated, he quipped, my head would surely spin with vertigo. Even the Tsar could not imagine such dizzying heights of glory. But, as he added, the higher you climb, the harder you fall.
What heights Napoleon fell from. In those brief few years, he led French armies to Italy,
Egypt, Spain, Austria, Prussia, and even Moscow itself. And during that meteoric time, this room, his library at the Chateau of Malmaison, was his still point, the place to which he could return. It was here, for example, that he worked on his famous law code, the Code Napoleon, at this desk, the desk painted by David. Here he returned after his abdication in 1814, in such despair that he'd attempted to commit suicide. He came back once more to meditate during the fateful 100 days before Waterloo. And after that last catastrophic defeat, the English allowed him to return here just once more before his final exile to distant St. Helena. The house was empty then. His former wife, the Empress Josephine, whose house it was, had died. She had kept this room exactly as it had been during their happiest moments together. Here, Napoleon had enjoyed moments of his greatest triumphs and moments of his greatest creativity. For in the story of art too, Napoleon was an extraordinary catalyst, not merely in the pictures that he commissioned or inspired here in France and in the Empire, but throughout Europe, for everywhere artists were touched by his aura. Napoleon's official architects, Percier and Fontaine, periodically had sent an illustrated newsletter of engravings to Tsar Alexander, showing the most recent public works commissioned by Napoleon. For after the coup d'etat that brought Napoleon to power, there was no end to his plans for making Paris into a capital worthy of imperial Rome. La Madeleine, begun as a church, was continued by Napoleon as a temple to glory. The architect Vignan intended it to be a replica of an antique Roman temple, incorporating statues and bas-reliefs and the use of rich materials. The purity and severity of Greek Doric was replaced by Corinthian splendor to commemorate ancient Rome, as was befitting an emperor who took as his ancestors the emperors Trajan and Alexander. Some of the most extravagant monuments since the fall of the Roman Empire were built by Napoleon as symbols of his dominion, and many are still tourist attractions in Paris today. Percier and Fontaine were also responsible for much of the replanning of Paris. They made a triumphal east-west route across the city. Another Roman touch was the long arcaded street, La Rue de Rivoli. They prepared designs for linking the Tuileries Gardens with the Louvre, and even started on the interior of the museum itself, where their inventive details can still be admired today. The newly constituted Louvre Museum became Napoleon's domain. He commissioned France's finest artists to glorify his deeds, and the most celebrated of all was Jacques-Louis David. Disappointed with the aftermath of the revolution, David had sworn never to trust in men again, only in ideas, yet he was fascinated by Napoleon and quickly succumbed to his spell. When he first met the young general and first consul of France, he said, "Oh, my friends, what a beautiful head he has. It is pure, it is great, it is as beautiful as the antique. Yes, Bonaparte is my hero." Decades before the revolution, the encyclopedist Diderot had suggested the Louvre be used for the public display of the royal collections. Afterwards, in 1793, it opened as the Muséum Central des Arts. Then came the brief but dazzling era of the Musée Napoléon, filled with the state treasures and the loot of his campaigns. It was here that David presented his newly finished canvas, The Sabine Women. It tells of the reconciliation between two warring tribes, the Romans and the Sabines, effected by a central allegorical female figure. Art historian Eva Burkhardt explains the remarkable device used by David to show this veiled plea for national reconciliation among the feuding factions of post-revolutionary France.
This mirror is not here by accident. During my research on the painter David in Paris, I had discovered that it was actually a part of the original exhibition that David organized to show his painting, The Sabine Women. The exhibition took place in this very museum. The function of the mirror was twofold. First of all, it was to draw the visitor's attention to the central and most important part of the painting, the women. The oval shape of the mirror echoed the circular arrangement of the women painted by David. Secondly, it was to control the way the painting was looked at. David wanted that the people not only look at the painting, but actually participate almost physically in it. The visitors saw themselves reflected in the mirror, side by side, the actors painted by David. David had problems finding female models for his painting. The rumor has it that the famous society women of the period offered to pose for the painter. At the opening of the exhibition, they arrived dressed in the Sabine costumes, and they actually kept them throughout the evening when they went to the theater, so that all of Paris would know that they were the ones who posed for David. But David didn't mean his female figures to be portraits. He wanted them to represent a political ideal. Seeing themselves in the mirror reflection, just as I can see myself now, the visitors to the exhibition were invited by David to rally to the Republican cause that these women represented.
Not only David, but also his pupils, Gros and Ingres, truly believed Napoleon was the only one capable of leading France out of the impasse of the Revolution without sacrificing its principles. They joined in the glorification of Napoleonic images. Their art became a vehicle for propaganda centered on the cult of the emperor's achievement, virtues, and personality. Here, David painted the victorious Bonaparte on a magnificent rearing horse crossing the Alps. If the truth be known, he was riding a common mule. Another famous image of the Bonaparte cult shows Napoleon walking fearlessly into the plague house at Jaffa in the Holy Land, unafraid of contagion because of his almost divine power to heal. His first officer, a mere mortal, holds a cloth to his face to shield himself from the plague, revolted by the stench. Less ethereal, more practical, Arab and French medical officers are desperately trying to provide medical aid to the plague victims. Bonaparte's great deeds during his life as a soldier would continue to be recorded and represented throughout his reign. It has been said that modern propaganda was Napoleon's invention. Now first painter of the empire, David was given his most important commission, a monumental work called Le Sacre, the Coronation. His early sketches show Napoleon audaciously crowning himself. The final canvas portrays Napoleon crowning Josephine. David painted himself, sketching the scene. Everyone had to be recognizably portrayed, including the members of the church, and the Pope, sitting quietly and unhappily as he watches Josephine kneel before the emperor, who holds the crown in his upraised arms. Napoleon's sisters were not only jealous of Josephine, but also of Josephine's daughter from a former marriage, whose child was rumored to be Napoleon's. Even Napoleon's mother, who in fact refused to attend the ceremony, was duly painted in. All the stars of the empire were gathered. The coronation was as much the triumph of Josephine as it was of Napoleon. For though she would never present Napoleon with an heir, she was the love of his life and wanted the world to know it. Ingres' own infatuation with the emperor prompted him to paint the official portrait of Napoleon in imperial robes. After the French Revolution, when the Louvre was transformed from a royal palace with private collections to a public museum, it was here that young painters could complete their art education by copying old masters, learning from the examples of the past. This tradition is still going on in the Louvre today. Where Pierre Rosenberg is chief curator of painting.
When Ingres painted his picture in 1814, he was very much admired and also very much criticized. Criticized because critics said there were 3 vertebrae too much in the back of this odalisque. What is an odalisque? An odalisque is a Turkish harem girl, and you recognize her very well through her costume. The colors are very soft, very precise, very beautiful. The harmony of it is the reverse of the very strong coloring that David had used for his great pictures. I really do love this picture. Why? Well, it's not sensual, it's erotic. It's an intellectual picture. It's painted with his brain. In spite of this, it's erotic. It's connected. In fact, it's a connection between brain and eroticism. Everything about eroticism is happening in the brain here and nowhere else. It's a very hot picture, but done by an artist whose conception about art is of a very high level. And in a strange way, Ingres was very much criticized in the 19th century because thought to be a reactionary artist, an artist of the past, an academic artist, a man bringing nothing new to art. And in the reverse has happened in our century, where Ingres, in a certain way, is so much and so rightly admired and is considered as one of the fathers of modernity and of modern art.
But such warm and luscious fantasies were far removed from the cold and appalling reality of the distant battlefields where the dramas of Napoleon's campaigns had taken place.
Gros was a pupil of David, but his art is quite different of David's art. Here you have the battlefield of Eylau the day after the battle. Of course, the hero of the battle, Napoleon, is in the middle of the picture. But there are also not only the victor of the battle, but also the victims of the battle. And that's quite new in French art, to present human beings, anonymous soldiers, dead soldiers, as they were after this terrible battle. And of course, this will open all a tradition, all in the 19th century French art. But Gros was the first in French art to do so, and he did so in a very moving, touching way.
Now the once glorious Napoleonic armies began their retreat from Moscow to Waterloo. With defeat, the French began to identify themselves with those fallen foreground figures, with the anonymous victims, rather than with the glories of Bonaparte. Myths of heroic or noble ends turned into deceptions, and more often than not, only pointless suffering and senseless torture remained. The blackness of war between Spain and France inspired Goya to sketch this series on the horrors of war, showing the factual account of man's cruelty to man. Goya watched the arrival of the foreign conqueror, believing at first that he was bringing reason, progress, order, and liberty. But in fact, he came to destroy and devastate, to violate and to massacre. The sleep of reason produces monsters. In his picture, 3rd of May, Goya showed the church in darkness, impotent before the faceless executioners of a secular martyr. Goya's nameless peasant symbolizes the whole of Spain, which rose against the Napoleonic invaders. Fire, destruction, violence, death, this was Spain between 1808 and 1814. The only source of illumination is the soldier's huge lantern. We are far from the beam of the Enlightenment. Soon after the Napoleonic Wars, and inspired by the French Enlightenment, the Greeks began their struggle for independence against the Turks. The French romantic painter Delacroix was passionately committed to the Greek cause. He lent his support to the Greeks in Greece on the Ruins of Missolonghi of 1826. Greece is portrayed as an idealized, impassioned woman dressed in white, reminiscent of David's central figure in the Sabine Women. She rises heroically above the rubble, arms extended, appealing for help in the cause of liberty.
And so the electrifying effects of the Napoleonic era, creative and destructive, left their mark on artists as well as on everybody else. The neoclassical style would continue into the 19th century, but arid and academic, incapable of imparting true feeling. And true feeling is at the core of the sensibility which followed the Revolution, the period we know now as the Age of Romanticism. There's no real definition of Romanticism.
We think perhaps of wild-eyed artists and poets like Keats and Shelley, of melancholy Gothic ruins and mysterious northern landscapes where 19th century men communed with nature. And all that is a part of it.
But the poet Baudelaire said that the key to Romanticism was not the subject matter or even truth itself, but feeling. That you should listen to that inner voice, and that alone would give art its merit. And so the old moralities which had driven art in the past, religion, traditional ethics, civic virtues and so on, were thrown out of the window. Even reason itself was seen to be insufficient. All that counted was feeling and experience. This new sensibility, heroic and sentimental, self-assertive and profoundly individualist, would lie at the center of Western art from that time until the present day.
France, like the rest of Europe, was now changing fast. A rapid rise in population, the spread of industry, a shift from country to city, and the emergence of an urban proletariat helped bring about the growth of new social structures, and with them political conflicts. The printing press was now enabling millions to receive new ideas in a time of growing turmoil, and it was in a newspaper, perhaps La Gazette, that Géricault read the horrifying account of the tragedy of the Medusa. In the summer of 1816, the French frigate, the Medusa, carrying soldiers and passengers, was wrecked off the African coast. The captain, of noble birth and a political appointment, was proved incompetent. Of the 115 men and women who tried to save themselves on a makeshift raft, only 15 survived. 13 days on a floating coffin, human beings reduced to a state of animal despair, a poignant human drama of corpses and victims who suffered atrociously but for no noble cause. Above, on the apex of the human pyramid, men and women gesturing frantically. This painting came to be regarded as a political allegory of a deeper sort. The French historian Michelet wrote, "France herself, our whole society is on that raft." The clouds of revolution were gathering again.
At the end of July 1830, Paris was up in arms. It was the end of the Bourbons, the ruling family of France for so many centuries. Everyone hoped in liberty and in freedom. It was a great moment of French history. Delacroix was not at all a radical, politically speaking. He was a quite famous artist at this moment of his life, and he immediately understood that it was for him the occasion to paint a great picture. And he painted a very great picture. It's, of course, a political picture. It is also a history picture. By history, I mean it's an allegory of freedom, and the lady in the middle of the picture, the woman in the middle of the picture, represents freedom and liberty. She has in her hand the French flag, the three colors of France, and she is dominating the picture where you see a lot of people, dead soldiers, workers, an intellectual wearing a hat. All these figures are taken in everyday life.
The figure of Liberty herself is wearing a slipped dress, barefooted like a Greek goddess. This woman of the people is no longer simply cast in antique language, as were the Sabine women. She is an ardent, vital, bare-breasted vision, brandishing a flintlock and waving her country's new flag. A woman of the people, wearing the Phrygian cap, the red bonnet, she has now become a universal symbol of revolution. And finally, of course, the figure of the French Republic itself.
Ironically, Delacroix's Liberty was bought by the liberal king, Louis-Philippe, who never dared show it. It wasn't publicly exhibited until 1861. 2 years afterwards, a distant ancestor of Delacroix's allegorical figure arrived in Paris, the winged Victory of Samothrace. It was sculpted in ancient Greece in about 200 BC. Like Liberty, Victory is portrayed as female, inspiring, alluring even, as she alights gently on the prow of a victorious warship, the wind streaming against her body. It's a theme which turns up in many forms in the story of Western art. Like Liberty, Victory
is a beguiling, idealized personification of an abstraction for which men and women have been prepared to die. In the 18th century, the Age of Reason used symbols like this in the belief that the humane values of classical tradition could be attained even today. The Revolution hung on to such symbols, both to express their high hopes and in the end to justify their worst excesses. And of course, these are still potent myths in our culture today. In the story of Western art, though, by the middle of the 19th century, change is in the air. Artists begin increasingly to be interested in portraying modern life, and they will turn their back on the classical tradition.
Funding for Art of the Western World was provided by the Annenberg CPB project.
Lot 42, the Claude Monet Naphias of 1908. £3 million is bid for this lot, 3 million. I have a bid of £3 million. 3,200,000, 3,500,000, 3,800,000, 4 million. At £4 million now, at £4 million, 4,200,000, 4,400,000. 4,500,000, 4,600,000, 4,800,000.
The paintings of this period are among the most familiar images in art. The greatness of the artists is a commonplace of Western culture.
It's yours.
But the Impressionists started out as radicals. When it was first exhibited, their art was rejected as disturbing, inept, incomprehensible, even immoral. Why were people so hostile? What was the accepted art of the period? In mid-19th century France, as so often in the story of the art of the West, art was a serious business loaded with political significance. It was used by the rulers not only to embody their ideals of beauty, but to enshrine the values which in their eyes underpinned a civilized and stable society. And art which didn't do that could be the object of contempt, of fear, and even of repression. There could hardly be a better example of what the official establishment art of the time looked like than this building, the Paris Opera House. It was constructed at vast cost. 10 lives were lost in building it, 500 houses destroyed to make way for it, all to celebrate the values of French bourgeois metropolitan culture. and the stability and continuity of its political life. In fact, this stability had been undermined by the Franco-Prussian War and the Siege of Paris in 1870. Then, in the following year, 1871, the people of Paris seized control of the city. But the Commune was overthrown with terrible brutality. Thousands of people were executed, and the center of the city was left partially wrecked. The opera was begun before the Franco-Prussian War, but only completed and opened after the crushing of the Commune. But while the finishing touches were being applied here, just across the city, an artist lay in prison. Gustave Courbet had been a member of the Paris Commune. He'd been accused of helping to destroy the Vendôme column, a symbol of French imperialism. Courbet came from the country. He came from the Jura near the Swiss border, and he saw himself as a wild man from the backwoods. He was a notorious rebel against establishment values in art. The Parisian art world was dominated by the Salon, a vast state-sponsored exhibition. Here, large-scale religious or historical subjects were preferred, showing dramatic deeds or moralizing themes like Couture's Romans of the Decadence. Highly popular too were images of beautiful women presented in settings remote in time or place, in classical antiquity or in imaginary Orient. There were also trivial anecdotal pictures of everyday life. Courbet called his art realist. Rejecting the idealized vision and false rhetoric of academic art, he painted the mourners attending a funeral in his own small town. Courbet said, "It was not my intention to attain the trivial goal of art for art's sake. No, my aim is to translate the customs, the ideas, and the appearance of my own epoch as I see them."
We're not told who's being buried, but it's clearly no one of national significance. But Courbet called his vast picture a history of a burial at Ornans. And by its size and by its title, he was claiming that the everyday customs of his own provincial society were just as worthy subjects of serious historical art as any other. Modern landscape and modern people were now the raw material for a serious form of painting. Courbet intended his picture to be seen at the Paris Salon, and it was clearly meant to shock, particularly in the political circumstances of 1850 when it was exhibited. In the elections of May 1849, about a third of the votes in the countryside had been polled for radical Republican candidates who opposed the presidency of Louis Napoleon. And to the urban bourgeoisie, these rural Republicans seemed a threat to the whole social order. Courbet was born here in Ornans, the son of a prosperous farmer, a member of the class which the Parisians had found so puzzling when they saw it depicted in the burial. Courbet presented himself as a man of the country, a sort of natural being with untamed appetites. Courbet was also an anarchist, a follower of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who wanted to do away with central government
and create a classless society of free individuals. Individualism and realism were closely connected for Courbet, who felt that the artist could only realize himself through an immersion in the physical world. I believe that painting is an essentially concrete art and can only consist in the representation of real and existing things. An abstract object does not belong in the domain of painting. Courbet's technique, with its loose brushwork and sweeps of the palette knife, producing simple, very physical surfaces of thick oil paint, tangibly records his engagement with the physical stuff of this world. Courbet's landscapes, with their simple natural elements, trees, crags, waterfalls, emphasize the primacy of the eye over the conventions of academic art. Placing himself and his art at the center of his political allegory, The Painter's Studio, he asserted the importance of the painter's individuality and his independence from the demands of the state and the artistic establishment. But his attack on the values of the salon was not a sign of indifference to it. His Bathers is a parody of the rhetorical poses of the classical tradition, with its blatantly unidealized women. The nude, too, that most traditional of subjects, had become part of the realist project.
Courbet's egalitarian ideas, his rejection of academic art, his insistence on being true to the appearance of the modern world as he saw it, all had a great influence on Manet and the Impressionists. But the modernity which they thought they should confront and portray in their art was not that of the country, but of the city, with its new classes, its parks, its suburbs, and its fashionable life. Baudelaire himself made a pioneer plea for a new art of the city when he said that the true artist will be he who snatches from the life of today its epic quality, who makes us see and understand how great, how poetic we are in our cravats and our patent leather boots.
Edouard Manet outlived Courbet by only a decade, but his work seems to belong to a different era. His own position as a fashionable man in the monde and demi-monde was not unusual, but this world had not hitherto been regarded as suitable raw material for art.
In 1862, he painted a fashionable gathering listening to music in the Tuileries Gardens. His technique was harshly criticized by his contemporaries. It was emphatically unlike the manual dexterity of academic training. He was criticized for treating everything alike. Clothes, umbrellas, chairs are given just as much significance as a face. The picture was contrived to seem artless, a personal response to his optical experience. And this in itself was an attack on academic hierarchies, of the face over the body, of the hero over the ordinary person in the street. But the first major scandal of Manet's career was provoked when he submitted the Déjeuner sur l'herbe to the Salon in 1863. It was rejected. The Déjeuner was a parody of earlier artistic traditions. Manet said, "I'm going to redo Giorgione's picture in the transparency of the atmosphere, with figures like you see over there by the river." The Déjeuner is an attempt, like Courbet's Bathers, to paint the nude in a modern way. But these are clearly city people, people you might know. And in bringing the scene up to date, Manet too has subverted the meaning of the earlier tradition. The situation is hard to fathom. Gestures and expressions make no obvious sense. And yet the directness of the woman's gaze invites us to participate in this equivocal situation. Undeterred by the reception of the Déjeuner sur l'Herbe, Manet submitted Olympia to the Salon in 1865. It was accepted, but it provoked great derision. The model was thought hideous and her surroundings degraded. Olympia, with her black servant, was identified by some critics as a Parisian prostitute. The treatment of the painting also shocked the viewers. The paint is applied with a calculated simplicity, and the lighting is harsh and frontal, leaving a ribbon of dark shadow round her body. Her presence is quite at odds with the finesse of academic painting. Olympia exposes the conventions which structured the display of sexuality in the nudes which were successful at the Salon. Nudes such as Cabanel's Birth of Venus, which won the Medal of Honor in 1863. Violating the principle that nudes in art must be remote and passive, this modern Venus challenges the viewer to respond to her gaze. Olympia is silenced but not rendered powerless by her position. And in the heavily censored regime of Napoleon III, she brought through the gates of the Salon a disturbing suggestion that there were elements in modern life that might not be under control.
The Industrial Revolution was bringing profound social changes to France. Paris itself was transformed by Baron Haussmann, the prefect of Paris, whose great boulevards were crashing through the old neighborhoods. An elegant, impersonal, modern city was created. New classes emerged and asserted their right to enjoy themselves.
Taking their cue from Manet, younger artists began to paint aspects of modern city life. But the city they observed was often an uncertain, anonymous place. It offered alienation as well as adventure. The cafe concerts were places of popular entertainment where people from different classes could mingle and their identities could be masked. Edgar Degas, in particular, explored places like these with an extraordinary variety of techniques, increasingly using pastel as a means of combining color with drawing.
Que je suis heureuse, ma chère, j'en perds la tête. Ah, ce n'est pas de l'amour pour plaisanter. Du beau Raoul, j'ai su faire la conquête. Je suis aimée et je peux m'en vanter. Cet amant-là m'a déjà fait connaître le désespoir, les pleurs, etc. Il voulait même me jeter par la fenêtre. Ah, quel plaisir quand on vous aime comme ça.
In the way he arranged his compositions, Degas looked to the example of the Japanese color print, whose customary viewpoints and cut-off compositions suggested ways of presenting his vision of the modern world.
Quand il me fait une caresse, j'emporte la marque et j'ai les bras tout bleus. À son désir, souvent, je me dérobe, car pour m'aimer, je sais que cet être-là va me déchirer mon jupon et ma robe. Ah, quel plaisir quand on vous aime comme ça. Quand on vous aime, quand on vous aime, quand on vous aime comme ça. Quand tu veux bien m'emmener à la promenade, selon des chemins couverts et poussiéreux. Si passe quelqu'un, Raoul devient maussade, il faut tout de suite que je baisse les yeux.
Pierre-Auguste Renoir painted a far more involved and festive vision of the era. The forms of the figures are dissolved into a play of patches of warm and cool color, which suggest the fall of sunlight through the trees. By this focus on the surface of appearances, Renoir treats the modern world as a spectacle, rather than creating the sort of moral narrative favoured by academic artists. Of this study, Nude in Sunlight, a newspaper critic said, "Would someone kindly explain to Monsieur Renoir that a woman's torso is not a mass of decomposing flesh with the green and purplish blotches that indicate a state of complete putrefaction in a corpse?" His La Loge was shown at the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874. This exhibition was an explicit rejection of the Salon because it was jury-free. All subscribers had a right to display their work. The show was dominated by outdoor scenes, mostly small, informal pictures which the artists painted in the open air in front of their subjects. Most critics welcomed the initiative of the exhibition, but many also complained that the works were unfinished, with their visible brushwork and their imprecise definition of form. The artists themselves distinguished between their more elaborate and tidily executed canvases and their sketches, rapid notations of subjects or natural effects. One of Claude Monet's sketches, Impression Sunrise, precipitated the naming of the group as Impressionists. The expatriate American James McNeill Whistler was also invited to join the first exhibition, but he preferred to continue showing his work in London, although his very simple, freely brushed nocturnes had much in common with the Impressionists' atmospheric sketches. It was this lack of finish which led the celebrated English critic Ruskin to accuse Whistler of flinging a pot of paint in the face of the public. The Impressionists' interest in open-air painting led them to the landscape on the outskirts of Paris and the expanding villages along the River Seine. Such areas were meeting places of several different worlds. Camille Pissarro made art out of the least prepossessing parts of his surroundings. Even a drab road in Louveciennes, where he lived, could provide the raw material for art. Pissarro generally peopled the streets of Louveciennes with peasant figures, showing it as a country village. But when Renoir painted the same stretch of road, he transformed it into a cheerful pleasure ground with fashionably dressed strollers from the city. Monet lived for 5 years at Argenteuil on the River Seine. He painted it over and over again in all weathers and all seasons. He was becoming increasingly concerned with the problems of translating fleeting light effects into paint. But he continued to explore the many different facets of the place. Industry itself, the cause of suburban expansion, was largely ignored or evaded, although the chimneys of a local factory made a discreet appearance. But all these landscapes show his surroundings very much in a process of change, of transformation. And this went right against the conventions of contemporary French landscape painting, which presented the countryside of France as a sort of timeless, historical world. Pissarro, who was an anarchist and a socialist, was one of the few Impressionists who tried to come to terms with the industrial landscape itself. By the early 1880s, in part because of commercial failure, the project of painting modern life began to be abandoned. Most of the group, by now in middle age, were in retreat from explicitly modern subjects, and they began to leave the city. Renoir became preoccupied with the nude in an increasingly timeless traditional way. Pissarro began to express his utopian anarchism in paintings of peasant life, adopting the techniques of younger artists who applied their paint in small points of colour. Light became Monet's central preoccupation. He was now less interested in the substance of the objects that he painted than in the ways in which their appearance was modified by the light and atmosphere which played across and around them. And he treated his subjects in long series of paintings showing the same motif in different lights. He said, "The further I go, the better I see that it takes a great deal of work to succeed in rendering what I want to render. Instantaneity. Above all, the envelope, the same light spread over everything, and I'm more than ever disgusted at things that come easily at the first attempt." This rejection of the sketch, together with his pursuit of the most transitory light effects, forced Monet to work up his increasingly elaborate paint surfaces in the studio, away from the natural subject. Eventually, he solved this predicament with his retreat into a world that he made for himself, a world in which nature was brought within a few yards of his front door and regularly weeded by his 6 gardeners. In the 1890s, Monet began to build his water garden at Giverny, and this garden, periodically enlarged, soon became his principal subject. Nature here was organized according to his exact specifications, and the light played across a world all of his own design. He could work out of doors summer after summer when the weather was right, but also work close by in his studio where his memory would be at its freshest and bring the pictures to the degree of finish he sought. He spent his final decade working on these huge canvases of the lily pond, and they remain an old man's celebration of the world of light and colour.
This is Monet's old studio, Giverny, now the gift shop, restored with lavish donations from foreign sponsors, especially Americans, Rockefeller, Ford, Henry Kissinger, Richard Nixon. And here you can buy the age of the Impressionists in reproduction. It's ironic that having started out as radicals, the Impressionists should end up being the art of the establishment, the most sought after, the most well-known, and the most reproduced art in history.
The familiarity of Impressionism deprives us of the disquiet the works provoked when they were first exhibited. The very modernity they tried to paint is now bathed in easy nostalgia. Painting the rituals and pleasures of an expanding middle-class world, the Impressionists hold up a flattering mirror to our own desires and aspirations. Here at the Restaurant Fornaise at Chatou by the River Seine, a group of people sit on a sunlit balcony, surrounded by the trappings of material well-being: food, drink, nice clothes, easy friendship, happy in themselves, confident in their world. But in the 1880s, a number of young, ambitious artists felt that the Impressionist technique had taken them as far as it could, and in their turn, they tried to push beyond that in a whole variety of ways. We call them post-impressionists, and many have detected in their work a subtle shift in the relationship between painting and the world it portrayed, as if perhaps modern life itself had become a problem for artists. In 1886, Georges Seurat exhibited his monumental work, Sunday Afternoon, on the island of the Grand Jatte. This is one of the most influential pictures of the 1880s, and it signals a radical departure from the Renoir. The picture depicts another island on the River Seine, also used by the Parisians for Sunday outings. The same kind of place as the Renoir. But Seurat painted people from a variety of classes, strangers to one another, and he painted them in a way which expresses a radically different experience of such places. It's hard to identify with the stiff figures. The style distances us.
The Grand Jatte was a watershed for the avant-garde of the 1880s. No ambitious artist could paint without acknowledging what Seurat had done to typical Impressionist subject matter. Seurat's innovation was also his style. His compositions are rigorously formal. He replaced Impressionism's casual spontaneity with discipline and order. He used current scientific theories of color and developed a systematic method of painting called pointillism. He applied his paint by means of small dots and thereby achieved what he called optical mixture and greater luminosity.
For this reason, the artists who adopted Seurat's technique became known as neo-impressionists. By the 1880s, there was a new generation of the avant-garde who lived and worked in an area north of the recently modernized center of Paris. Seurat had his studio on the corner of the Boulevard Clichy. Paul Signac lived around the corner. Vincent van Gogh joined them when he arrived from Holland in 1886. There was still general agreement that modern Paris was the proper subject for advanced, ambitious painting. What was new was the variety of competing styles with which artists responded to both Impressionism and Seurat's Neo-Impressionism. Émile Bernard turned to Japanese and medieval art to find his answer: flattened colours and simplified forms which sometimes verged on caricature. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec studied popular art forms, especially posters, to bring out the seamier side of the places of popular entertainment. Living in a less prosperous district of the city, Van Gogh followed several artists to paint in Paris's industrial outskirts. undoubtedly political commitments involved in this interest in the working class quarters of Paris. Signac wrote in the anarchist journal La Révolte that the neo-impressionists were bringing their witness to the great struggle which is taking place between the workers and capital.
But across the political spectrum, from left to right, key artists of the 1880s became intrigued by the hybrid terrains on the outskirts of modern Paris. It was here that the economic and social forces which were remaking the modern city lay momentarily exposed. But in the images they produced, we can see the difficulties they encountered in making a modern art in this landscape.
In a series of watercolours, Van Gogh tried to represent these ragged edges of the city, where working-class people came to take a breath of fresh air, amidst the random elements of piecemeal industrial and urban development. The most telling peculiarity of these drawings is the literalness with which all this is set down. Yet the artist and hence the viewer are kept at a distance by the yawning, empty foreground. In Signac's painting of the road to Gennevilliers, the artist makes us look across an open space to the line of factories in the industrial township of Asnières. Marked out for future development, awaiting houses and factories, this sheer expanse of empty terrain is disturbing. We have to wonder why any painter could conceive of painting a scene apparently so devoid of incident and meaning.
It was in this marginal territory that it was felt the modern could almost be grasped. Could painting make visual sense of such a landscape and its meanings? Perhaps only by keeping at a distance or making your paintings a purely formal or stylistic exercise. For instance, in Seurat's view over the field of Lucerne to the distant factory town of Saint-Denis, we see very little in the vast empty foreground except a lot of brushwork. Characterizing what was then called the new art was a growing concern with questions of style, technique and form.
Groups of artists formed around different styles and programs, and they began to compete intensely with each other. One critic wrote, "All these tendencies make me think of moving kaleidoscopic patterns which clash at one moment only to reunite at another." Undoubtedly, this was a period of immense innovation and diversity. Yet contemporary critics such as Félix Fénéon recognized an underlying similarity. Comparing the work of Seurat and Paul Gauguin, Fénéon argued that they both maintained a distance from their subjects. Seurat, he said, applied science. Gauguin used reality only as a pretext for what Fénéon called distanced creations. By the late 1880s, these artists started to abandon the attempt to engage with modernity in the uncertain form of the city. They left Paris for regions and cultures in which they were tourists. Tourists travel to places where the customs of the people can be absorbed as sights, as experiences of the different and the new. The avant-garde artists went to a prosperous, developing Brittany, but imagined it as primitive, mystic and strange.
In August 1888, Bernard painted Breton women in a meadow. It depicts the display and leisure of a Breton Sunday outing, and it is clearly a direct response to Seurat's Grand Jatte. But it is very different. Bernard emphasizes the flatness of the picture surface. He does not use traditional perspective, and he makes no attempt at naturalism. Instead, he used the example of Japanese prints and medieval stained glass to compose a picture that is only held together by its own invented order of marks and colours on a flat surface. As a result of such stylization, we have no access to or empathy with the Breton people depicted. We need to think carefully about what it means to medievalize a 19th century Breton peasant, or to transform Brittany into Japan. When Van Gogh saw the painting, he made a copy of it, and he called it A Sunday Afternoon in the Meadow, thus directly recalling Seurat's title. Within a few weeks of seeing Bernard's painting, Gauguin produced his bid for leadership of the avant-garde. In Vision After the Sermon, Gauguin painted a red field in which pious women vividly imagine a scene described to them in a sermon they have just heard about Jacob wrestling with an angel. It is another distanced creation. In his invention of the subject matter, Gauguin draws on contemporary tourist myths of a medieval and mystical Brittany. And the painting relies for its meaning on a city dweller's fantasy of the superstitious piety of peasant women.
Van Gogh also left Paris after only 2 years in the capital and settled in Provence in the south of France. He had come to believe that the renaissance of modern art would only take place away from the city, symbol of a decadent and diseased society. But he also wanted to keep in touch with developments in the avant-garde. He invited Gauguin to visit him, and both artists painted from the same subjects. Gauguin painted the scene in Arles as a tapestry of saturated, flat colours and shapes. He encouraged Van Gogh to move away from naturalism and impressionism and to experiment radically with colour and perspective. Van Gogh was brought up in the country, in Holland. The landscape of the south of France was unfamiliar to him. He was a stranger, a tourist down here, and this was another country. Like many northern Europeans, he imagined the Mediterranean to be an exotic, fiery world, and that's what he made it. He painted its people and their agriculture in landscapes drawn not only from what he saw around him, but from Japanese prints and even from etchings by Rembrandt. Here, he said, he was seeking his Japan, in other words, a world of the imagination, and here he found it. In his collection of Japanese prints, Van Gogh saw a beautiful, sun-filled, harmonious world, which he imposed on the landscapes of Provence. The prints themselves gave him confidence to use colour more brilliantly and in a more arbitrary way. Yet unlike Gauguin and Bernard, he never really understood the implications of the prints in terms of surface and flatness. His surfaces are thick encrustations of paint, but they always refer, often vividly, to the quality and texture, shape and perspective of what he painted. He painted himself at this time as a workmanly Japanese painter. He wrote to Gauguin, "I have aimed at the character of a simple monk worshipping the eternal Buddha." Eventually, suffering from epilepsy and considered mad by many of the people who came into contact with him, Van Gogh was confined in the sanatorium here at Saint-Rémy near Arles. From his window, he could look out on the weird, rocky outcrops of the Alpes Mountains. And in June 1889, that view inspired one of his most famous paintings. The painting is Starry Night.
Starry Night was an attempt to make a modern religious art. Van Gogh was suspicious, however, of the Catholic undertones of Bernard's and Gauguin's religious themes. Here he uses typically Protestant nature symbolism, suns and stars and trees striving upwards towards the heavens. Incorporating a cypress tree so characteristic of Provence, the painting nevertheless has a Dutch church and Dutch cottages. Van Gogh painted Starry Night using modern colour theory. The complementary pair of yellow for light and blue for darkness translated the black and white opposition of religious pictures of divine illumination, such as Rembrandt's print of the Annunciation to the Shepherds. And it was also typical of Dutch 17th century woodcuts of celestial revelations. Unfortunately for Van Gogh, neither Bernard nor Gauguin recognized this work as a reply to theirs. It was seen simply as a somewhat over-stylized village in the moonlight. Paul Cézanne also lived and worked in Provence. With Seurat, Cézanne was the most influential figure of this generation. He had had a decisive contact with the Impressionists in the 1870s, but he left Paris and went home to the family estate in Provence. There, for the rest of his life, he painted and repainted the landscapes where he had spent his boyhood. Cézanne was not a tourist. He was therefore quite different from all the other artists we've discussed so far. Cézanne alone remained faithful to the Impressionist program of open-air painting, an art based on direct observation of the physical world. Day after day, for almost 30 years, he set himself to find an answer to this question. Could he make a new art based entirely on what he called his petites sensations? Petites sensations was one of Cézanne's key concepts. Sensation in French has two meanings. It refers both to physical perceptions and also to human feelings. Cézanne was never a distanced observer. The countryside was the living proof of the people who had used it, shaped it, marked it. But it seems that he felt that it was only by a careful study of the precise physical forms of nature, the actual colours that he saw, that he could reach through to the full implications of its human meaning. He was later to write, "I am its consciousness, the landscape thinks itself in me." When Cézanne painted the people of the region, he produced monumental portraits of people he neither sentimentalized nor patronized. If there is a distance between himself and his subjects, it is one of respect for the difference between himself, a middle-class man, and those of another class and culture. He submitted people to the same discipline as the mountain, while he patiently analyzed the field of colored light for which his paintbrush had to find an adequate sign on canvas. was his honesty about the status of art as representation which led Cézanne to his preoccupation with technique. He wrote, "I wished to copy nature, but I could not. But I was satisfied when I discovered that though the sun could not be reproduced, it could be represented by something else, colour." In the 1880s, like Seurat, Cézanne rejected the disorder of Impressionist painting and evolved what has been called his constructive brushstroke, carefully building up his pictures by small facets of finely modulated colour. This makes his pictures dense and at times claustrophobic. But Cézanne always tried to recreate through colour a sense of space and solidity of form. Women artists of the avant-garde painted another equally vivid aspect of modernity. Unable to frequent brothels, bars and cafes, artists like Mary Cassatt represented the world they knew intimately. Her subjects were drawn from the rituals and disciplines of middle-class womanhood. Cassatt joined the Impressionists in 1879. But her work of the 1880s and 90s exhibits many features of post-impressionism in its move towards greater solidity and more organised surface. Yet her pictures are not distanced from their subjects. They balance a self-conscious exploration of medium and form with a concern to convey a known social and psychological reality. In the bath, Cassatt made use of the example of Japanese art, but she used it to achieve intensity and monumentality. The tilted perspective, the play of patterns, all testify to formal experimentation, but the effect is to concentrate the viewer's attention on the solidly placed woman and child and on what they are doing. The mundane act of bathing is thereby invested with dignity and meaning. Suzanne Valadon, a one-time milliner and circus performer, became an artist model. Renoir painted her, but she also began to paint for herself. The contrast between the images painted by women and the representations of women produced by men alerts us to the sexual politics in the formation of modernism. A persistent factor in the paintings of this era was a kind of sexual tourism. In 1891, Gauguin travelled to the South Pacific in search of a distant mythic paradise. As a European man in the French colony of Tahiti, Gauguin found it easy to take a wife from amongst the young Tahitian women and to use her as his model. He wrote to his European wife about this painting called Manao Tupapao of his 13-year-old bride in terms redolent of the colonizers' complacency and racism. I painted a nude of a young girl. In that position, a trifle can make it indecent. And yet I wanted her that way. The lines and the action interested me. I gave her a somewhat frightened expression. Gauguin added the figure of the spirit of the dead, he said, to account for the girl's frightened expression. These people are very much afraid of the spirits of the dead. Gauguin uses colour, patterns and simplified forms, as well as invented mythologies to create an image of the exotic. Yet the painting nonetheless recalls Olympia on her white bed. The displayed body and the watching figure all tie this image back into European concerns.
From Manet to Picasso, From Olympia to the Demoiselles d'Avignon, male avant-garde artists have staked their claims as ambitious modernists on the bodies of women. The major paintings of European modernism are surprisingly often paintings of the female nude. The power men enjoy make women available for artistic experimentation and colonization.
In many ways, modern art rejected the humanist traditions of Western art, but it never abandoned the female nude. Instead, it used women's bodies for its most extreme innovations and fantasies. On their bodies, the implication of distanced creation is there for all to see.
There is no such thing as objective art history. There are only the interpretations of art historians. The work of these artists has been assessed in different ways.
From Courbet's country peasants to Manet's new classes in the cities, from Monet's realism of light to the visions of Van Gogh, the painters we've been looking at seem to progressively move away from the real world, rejecting external appearances in favor of an inner, personal, imaginative truth.
What we have seen is a crisis about how to handle the modern in its immediate form of the city. And the importance of the artists of the 1880s and 90s is as a kind of hinge. Artists still felt themselves responsible to the world, its social as well as its natural orders. But they had also opened up a realm of hitherto unimagined freedom for art. Later artists saw in the imaginative colors of Gauguin, in the exhilaration of Van Gogh's energetic brushwork, and above all in the inventiveness of Cézanne's later work, resources which were to inspire the whole array of 20th century isms, from purism to expressionism, from fauvism to cubism.